Hello, and welcome to my book talk. I did a book launch online about a week ago, and unfortunately, I didn't manage to record it the way that I wanted it to. So I'm just gonna do basically the same talk, but without any questions. Although, please feel free to ask questions if you want in the comments below. My name is Kim Anderson, and my book is called Dreaming Life's Language. It came out earlier this year through EBL. It's now available in a few different places. I'm not totally certain yet which countries. I know for sure in Canada and Spain and Portugal. And if you go to my website, www.kimberlyanderson, that's Kimberly, KIMBERLEYANDERSON.com, then you can find a few different links through Amazon, FNAC, or Libros. So, first of all, I just want to thank the Romero Perez family for helping me get this book published, and also Aaron Swanbergson, who is my editor. So, the way that I started writing this book was all the way back in 2008. I decided to change my life and move away from fine arts and animation, which is what I'd been doing. And I decided to start writing and studying science. So it was a big switch, but that experience was also the inspiration for this book because I felt that what I was going through back then was sort of a crisis that I believe is at least somewhat explained by a theory that I found in another book called The Cosmic Serpent by Jeremy Narby. Now, in that book, he describes a theory about where our visions and dreams come from, which he suggests is from our DNA. So, this was a very fascinating theory, and I had read it a couple of years before I had this experience. And it was a lot of weird dreams and a lot of weird coincidences, and I was just starting to think, I think that theory really makes sense. I think it is explaining what I'm going through now. Now, I have a rare genetic disease. At that time, it wasn't diagnosed. I've only been diagnosed for about 4 or 5 years. And so, obviously, there's a genetic issue. And what I felt was happening is that my body was basically trying to get the message to me that I could not continue being an artist. The disease does affect my hands, and I wasn't fully aware of just how much they would be affected at that point. But I had been planning on continuing and even doing a master's in fine arts. And I was just getting the message of no, you can't do that. You can't continue. You have to start writing and you have to get really objective. So that experience made me want to investigate this theory in more detail to see what was behind it so that I could explain to everyone why I went a little bit weird for a bit and to offer some kind of theory that would actually make sense because I think a lot of the theories that we have for psychology right now don't actually have a lot of scientific basis behind it. So the subconscious was getting a hold of me saying, hey, stop doing art, start doing writing. And I think the other reason behind that was I'd been doing art for quite a while and making these short films. And the rate of animation is about a year per minute of animation. So I'd been working really hard on this and getting deep into the meaning of the animations that I was doing and looking at it on 5 or 6 different levels. But when you watch a 5 minute film, you don't think about all that deep stuff. You don't even understand it. You usually have a pretty simplistic explanation of what it meant. So what that inspired me to do was to actually explain it. I said, well, if I'm getting all of these ideas and I was writing so much while I was animating, so that was the inspiration to also write a book that would explain what the art was really teaching me and what it was meaning. And I think also a lot of art critics or art historians tend to simplify what artists mean as well because they look at it mostly socially and politically and symbolically, but they don't necessarily look into what the experience of the artist was that was causing these things to happen. So I was getting more and more interested in the biology of what it means, what the process is of making art. rather than just looking at it from an external context. So the book is essentially a collection of essays. So it's not written in a chronological order. It is nonfiction. It's a book essentially of scientific philosophy. So the first part of the book really delves into the theory that I was discussing. I go through the science and look through studies to see what more evidence I could find to back up this theory. Now, I reached out to a couple other people to see. I know Jeremy Narby said there wasn't anything new. There wasn't so much to show a full scientific narrative of DNA to dreams, but there's a lot of pieces that definitely lead us to show that that could be the case. Now, a lot of that has to do with bioluminescence, and we all have bioluminescence in our bodies. If you sit in a dark room with a camera with a long exposure, eventually it's going to show a glow coming out of your body. So we all have this bioluminescence coming from us. And what this theory is saying is that that bioluminescence is actually coming from our DNA. Now, the DNA, the molecule with a specific shape, and Narby's suggestion was perhaps that it was these non-coding pieces of DNA that have a repetition in them that were perhaps acting like a laser, because a laser is a pulsated light that's super focused. And so that could be part of the explanation. Now, a lot of these types of scientific inquiries are happening, I think, more in the East. So Japan and Russia are showing a little more interest in kind of a little more esoteric type of science. And so I looked at a little bit of that. There's a lot about bioluminescence just in general in biology, and it's been shown to influence a lot of different things, like eggs influence each other by the bioluminescence coming off of them. So to basically describe the whole theory is, imagine in each and every one of your cells there's DNA, and all of them are in various states of creating proteins and epigenetic activity. Epigenetics is when your genes are actually doing things. And so if you can imagine, all of that information, all that bioluminescent information is going through a cascade through your body, each cell influencing another cell, going all the way through your body. And so basically either going through your neurons, which is also conducting electricity, perhaps going through your bloodstream, various ways it's going up. And then in your head, you have what's called the pineal gland. And in the pineal gland is actually retinal tissue. So the same tissue that we have in our eyes is in that same place. They've called it the third eye because it really does perceive light. So what that theory is saying that all that light energy coming through your DNA is going and getting read by that gland, and that's feeding into your brain to give you dreams, visions, and all of these internal visual states. So that's sort of the explanation. And I go through that in the first couple of chapters. And then in the third chapter, Other Worlds, I go a little bit more into the idea of the subconscious. So, what are these various states of mind that we have? This is a fascinating topic. So, I go through a little bit of what we see in our inner eye and what our inner visual states are. So, regular nighttime dreams, daydreams, fantasies, trance states. There's a lot of different ways that we see other things other than this what is right in front of us. Hallucinations, of course, and I go a little bit more into depth in different kinds of hallucinations. Sometimes they are really simple aberration in our vision, and sometimes they are very elaborate and intelligent things going on and voices and so on. So I go a little bit more into that, and then Chapter 4, I go more into my own art practice and what I learned through my own artistic exploration, and also into religious art and the connection between religious art and surrealism. So these are all art forms that purposely show the things that aren't really there. They show the narratives of events or of inner states of consciousness. And I kind of focus specifically on that kind of art because people do make art for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes it is very practical or very technical. And this is more about the art where you're trying to get in touch with the subconscious, or you're just allowing the art to flow in a way that you're not really thinking about, because that's the kind of art that I think is the most connected to that inner dream state. And there's a lot of different artists that do that. And so I go a little bit more into what I learned from that process and some of the art that I did that was more along those lines, especially with my animation. So there are a few pictures in the book. Not a lot, but there are a few. So that's the first part, kind of getting right into the nitty gritty of the background of that. And then part two, I take kind of a big step back and I want to look at the whole philosophy of sort of how have we come to where we are, where what we believe about science and religion and art. How did we get here? So I really focus in now on the philosophy of science and kind of placing it in a religious context, because the fact is a lot of the early scientists were also religious. I talk a little bit about Rene Descartes because he's often used as the example of Cartesian duality, who separated the mind and the body, but I think that's a little bit unfair, although I haven't, read all of his works, but he was very inspired by angels. He had strange dreams about angels and he talks a lot about God. He actually felt that the reason we need doubt in our scientific experiments is precisely because we're so much less than God, and that actually these scientific experiments were showing us what God is. So he wasn't as much of a hard materialist as I think that he's made out to be. But basically I wanted to show the connections between that, and also a lot of early scientists were monks and nuns because they were living in a isolated environment. They had a lot of time on their hands, and so they got engaged in a lot of different kind of scientific experiments as well. So the whole origin of science is not all that separate from a spiritual or religious context at all. Now, chapter 6, I go more specifically into medicine. So I'm kind of leading us into understanding psychology as well, because obviously this theory incorporates not just microbiology, but also psychology. And medicine and medical research, there's a lot of things that have sort of become custom within science that maybe aren't as perfect as we think they are. So taking apart a little bit like double-blind studies, which are considered sort of the gold standard, but there's also a lot of flaws to that type of way of researching. And even in my own case, when you have a rare disease, you can't really compare one group to another group because there's not enough people that even have this disease. So we kind of have to look at different ways of looking at the body in order to understand the best way to study medicine is maybe not as easy and reductionist as we think it is. Now, chapters 7 and 8 go a little bit more specifically into psychology. Chapter 7, I go more into the origins of psychotherapy or talk therapy that was developed by Freud. And there's a lot of really kind of ugly underground history going on there with Freud. A lot of things have been covered up. It sort of shows like something that I keep running into over and over again when I'm looking at research is a lot of really, really important good ideas were repressed, and a lot of them are not known to the public. And that's just because people have vested interest in keeping certain things quiet. So the power dynamic between a therapist and a client is kind of what I look at, and I question that a lot because I think that there is that danger in talk therapy, and it isn't necessarily also known to always be of benefit. I think it's one of those things that we're not studying in a way that really makes sense because science is supposed to be objective. But if we're just studying a conversation, like talk therapy is just a conversation. So what is it exactly about that conversation that is supposed to be therapeutic? So I go into more detail into that, kind of pulling that apart. And then chapter 8 goes more into specifically the genetics research that has been done on people, not just with psychology. I talk a little bit about ethnicity too, and the way that we really don't have any agreement between culture and science right now on how to name people. And also, I take apart twin studies. There's an author named Jay Joseph that did a really good job of looking at these twin studies that they did, where they pulled twins apart and raised them separately and tried to compare them later on to see if their upbringing affected their psychology. But the irony of that is that, number one, adoption is a trauma. Being separated from a twin is also a trauma. And then, because of the study, oftentimes these twins would meet each other And they would have these dramatic reunions, and they would often be very closely influenced by each other's psychology. So, what this theory does for those studies, it kind of shows a different explanation for why people that are genetically closely related have similar psychological issues. And that's not always because just that they're similar and that these problems came up spontaneously, but actually that the interaction between two people that are genetically similar is going to have a bigger influence on them than if they're not genetically similar. And I also talk a little bit more just genetic similarity doesn't always have to mean being related either. And chapter 8, if I wrote it now, it would be even longer because there's so much new evidence and so many new studies showing this type of connectivity between friends, between people that have been found through facial recognition software, and they meet each other and they find out that they have all these things in common. There's pattern within our genetics that is showing how we connect to each other, even people who have pets that look like them. There's also genetic similarities with other species as well. So that's a really interesting one. And I'm going to do a little reading now from chapter 8. It's called Likeness and Likelihood, and this is page 135. Life is a projection of an idea encapsulated in an event so tiny we cannot even see it with our bare eyes. Yet we are part of a system that depends entirely on this mechanism. The act of creation is always about coming together and replication in ideas, in life forms, and perhaps in the entire universe. We are a projection because we come out of this small event and proceed to grow. In the way a light coming out of a flashlight grows the further it travels, pushing itself outward, so we grow and expand. The original zygote from which we each sprang, a few cells in a glob, created from uniquely selected halves of each parent, and the current cells we now house in our bodies are similar but also very different. We are a slow explosion that dissipates with time. What are the consequences of comprehending our own life structure? The effects of knowing how genes bend, break, replicate, and evolve means that we have the power to change them. Altering genetics is problematic in that we are creating unknown results for future generations. The limitations on genetic research stem from an inability to grasp the societal impacts of its discoveries, and these play out at the level of the individual scientist, the research group or department, the business, society in general, or even the biosphere. DNA as a concept is great fuel for science fiction, theorizing, and philosophizing. I am in awe that whatever we are made of is the same stuff that is looking back on itself and interpreting the results of experiments at a microscopic level. We look at the details of our being because we have created tools to see very far outside and inside of ourselves. It is easy in this enterprise to forget exactly where the self is in all of this. DNA replication is a game of telephone that is always in a state of fluctuation. The actual protein synthesis accomplished by DNA is in various states of activity all the time. Cells are busybodies, and they have a projection and lifespan that is usually many times less than our own average human lifespan. They are our tiny selves, replicated in such small detail that we brush them off, wash and flush them away, excrete them, or breathe them out every day. The tiny deaths of our cells require no funerals, as their bodies become protection. All our outer skin cells and our hair are made of dead cells. So that's the end of part 2, and then part 3 of the book goes a little bit wider, and it looks at not just what evidence there is for this theory, but it looks at what it means that this theory could be correct, because what I think it's giving us is the possibility of a framework that can actually show that scientific ethics are scientifically valid. So the ethics don't just come from outside of science, they come from within it. Because once we realize that all of the DNA organisms on the planet are basically part of the same stuff, that we're all part of this life network, we can't really put ourselves above any of that. We are integrated into it and we are part of it, and we're not really that special. We make ourselves special because we feel special, But I don't believe that that is a good way to be human or to be an organism. Now, chapter 9 is about reproduction and evolution. In this chapter, I go a little bit more into some ideas about patriarchy. Now, this chapter ended up inspiring me to write the next book that I'm looking at, which is a very in-depth examination of birth rates and different types of attitudes, especially patriarchal attitudes, which I think have really infiltrated into how we deal with reproduction in a way that's really negative. And that's for the simple reason that we are mammals, and mammals comes from the same word as mother, which has to do with the fact that the female body gestates and protects its own young and feeds them with our own bodies. And so we should always come first. Women should always come first when it comes to reproduction. That's just common sense. So the whole idea of patriarchy puts fathers above mothers and makes them more important, which doesn't make any sense. And I think that patriarchy too has within it the capacity to really, really destroy the intelligence of the species. It's basically pushing us to become a worse species, more diseased, more angry, more dysfunctional, more violent. All these negative things that we really don't want in our society. A lot of that has come from patriarchy. And part of that too, I think how that relates to this theory is when you look at the subconscious, this also is involved in how you're feeling, right? The feelings, emotions, subconscious, often we have to look into our subconscious because we get these emotions and we don't know where they're coming from. A lot of us get triggered by things that we're not fully aware of why they're happening. Now, when that comes to reproduction and choosing a mate, what that means is that it's so important to be able to listen to your intuition, to listen to your body. It's not just your feelings, it's not just lust or however people want to put that, but it's your body is actually giving you a message that, hey, this person could be compatible with you physically. And that's really important. And that's a reason why I think it's very damaging when we put other things like money or status or parents in a position of authority over who we choose as a partner. So I think that's giving us some evidence to show that that patriarchal control system where people are very controlled in who they're allowed to be with, I think that that is really damaging in a lot of ways. So that's an idea that I go into a lot more detail in my next book, but that's basically where chapter 9 is at. Chapter 10, good health. This is where I talk a little bit more about disability. As a disabled person, I've definitely had to experience a lot of trouble. And, I think we're in sort of a weird place as a society because I don't think there's any minority group at all that is more diverse than disabled people because any part of your body or your mind could change and put you in a position of disability. So disabled people do not all have the same opinions about things. And I think that's important to remember. That goes for other groups as well, but I think especially for disabled people because sometimes we have opposite disabilities. So the things that we might need as an individual could be opposite to what someone else needs. The two main points that I'm making here, one of them is that we do need to give as much as possible to help disabled people live a full life, not just because that's the right thing to do, but also because they can get better with that. There's a lot of people that suffer with disability, and then with ableism and discrimination, they get worse and worse. And we don't have to have it that way. There's a lot of new discoveries. With my disease, there's new treatments coming up, and we have a lot of capacity to heal. So I think the discrimination against disabled people is really, really harmful. And also the fact that there's really not enough money. Here in Canada, they decided that $2,000 a month was enough for a normal person for CURB during the pandemic. $2,000 a month. Well, there is no province in the country that gives anywhere near that amount on a monthly basis to disabled people. So what that means is you get into a downward spiral because disabled people will need more money than the average person, not less. And so that puts you at this constant poverty level where you can't get out of this hole of poverty. And it's really, really damaging. But on the other hand, the other point that I want to make is that we can prevent disabilities and we can prevent diseases from starting. And that's by using the wisdom. And that goes back to the previous chapter about reproduction, is that if we have healthy reproductive practices, if we followed that, and that was something that I believe was more prominent in matriarchal societies, but when patriarchal societies took over, they attacked those things, and they attacked reproductive knowledge, and they attacked women's knowledge. And there's even theories that show that the whole reason that we started getting smarter from our ape past and why our brains started growing is precisely because women figured out the best way to use reproductive health. And then when the patriarchies took over, what they did is they started to reduce that. And actually, we've seen that the size of the human brain has been going down for 10,000 years, and it's increased in the last 4,000 years. And the things that also increased in those times were patriarchal, violent cultures. So, what that means is that we are now purposefully encouraging harmful births. And I come out very strongly against IVF and surrogacy because they cause real harm and they go against the basic principles of evolution. Because our evolution happens without our conscious decision. And the more that we control reproduction and try to control other people's reproduction, and even try to control other animals' reproduction, the more that we harm them. There's a reason why the wild type in genes and why wildness is healthier. And that's because the individual has to fight for themselves, and they protect themselves, and they grow themselves. But when we get into this tightly packed control type of environment, we start to reduce our genetic fitness and we start to actually harm people. So in ways that medicine, instead of helping people, sometimes now people become so reliant on it and use medicine even when they don't need it, that they're actually causing serious harm. And these effects of the harmful practices that are started today with artificial reproduction, I fear are going to be very, very harshly felt in future generations. And I expect that it's going to be banned either, I would hope, sooner than later, because if it happens later, it's going to be because so many people have been harmed by it that it's going to take a mass revolt against these practices to stop them. Now, Chapter 11, Earthbound, go a little bit more into environmentalism and what this theory can provide for the environmental movements and for ecology, because it's very much a pro-ecology theory. You know, if our DNA is speaking to our subconscious and our subconscious is connected to everybody else's subconscious, that gives us this sort of collective unconscious idea that Jung brought up, but it connects it also to other species. So I think of it now, I call it the biospheric intelligence. So if I'm getting a message from my subconscious telling me certain things about other organisms or whatever it is, that's part of the biospheric intelligence. It's not just our own DNA, but it's the DNA of all of the organisms on Earth, possibly even the organisms that are already gone, because our ancestry and all of our genetic history is also held in our DNA. So this has a lot to provide for environmentalism and ecology because it shows that the biosphere is really, really very connected. And if we get more in touch with our subconscious and we understand how that works better, then it can lead us to becoming also more empathetic towards other organisms and towards each other, and change, how we see things, and especially how we do scientific experiments. Because that's really the main reason why I never went into science when I was younger. Even though I had really good marks in biology and math, I didn't want to go there because I didn't want to torture animals. That's my number one reason why I did not go into science. So what this is showing us is that there is a reason beyond that. If we are more empathetic and we are in touch with our subconscious, it would pull us away from ever torturing or putting any animal through any kind of pain. And it would stop us from interfering in the gene lines of other animals and using them as these, genetically modified organisms to help us with our research. Instead, we would understand that all of the research we do on them should be for their benefit and not just for us, because the anthropocentric model has no scientific basis. That's the biggest thing that we have to understand. Even though science is mostly a pretty human-made concept, that doesn't mean that the truths that we come out of it are also going to show us that we're the greatest. In fact, what it's showing us is something very different. And it's also showing us that science can be very dangerous if it's done improperly, when we try to interfere in the lives of other animals without caring about what the outcome is for them. So Chapter 12, Evolving Forward, this is kind of looking into the future. What is our future for the species? Can we evolve in a positive way where we increase our health, where we increase our intelligence, where we increase our positive connections with each other, where we become more empathetic, more caring, kinder animals, rather than more brutal, more machine-like? The cyborg future is not one that I'm looking forward to. I don't like the direction that a lot of us are going. The technophilia is just become really, really rampant, where people are so obsessed with machines that they think that they are more important than us. We now have AI making decisions for us that nobody asked for, that nobody wants. And the sad thing about that is that it shows us just how much more intelligent our life intelligence is. The DNA intelligence that we have, I believe, is more intelligent than our human brain intelligence. And I think that's really, really important to understand. Because if you look at that history, that we're losing our brain power with time, it could be very well because we've projected our intelligence into machines, allowed them to become more intelligent than us, while we ourselves become dumber. And that's a scary proposition. So, this book is a call to understand ourselves better, to understand that our DNA is really, really, really intelligent. It's been going on for billions of years. It's been going on far, far, far longer than we ourselves have been human. We are directly connected to our ancestors of many different types of organisms. We consume organisms. Organisms consume us. We are a part of this fabric of life. And I think that is so important to understand. And I think that this theory can provide a framework. And I genuinely hope that scientists will listen to this and start to look at what they can contribute, how they can understand their own minds. So, as far as what's going on now and where I'm headed next, I wanted to go a little bit into what I've learned since I wrote the book, because it's been over a year since I've kind of put it aside. I was almost ready to publish it at the beginning of the pandemic, and then I put it aside and edited it again. So it took a long time to write, because what this book did was it made me see my own cognitive dissonance. The phrase that kept coming up when I started writing was the problem with science is, and I kept repeating that I had so many problems that was really annoying me. But at the same time, I was like, well, I have to study it too. I have to focus on it. I have to unpack those problems that I have with science so that I could move forward and understand it better. And what I realized is that I had a lot of cognitive dissonance, that I was contradicting myself as I was reading what I was writing with my philosophy. I was changing a lot. So the different modes I would go into would be like, I would in science mode, then I would go into spirituality or religious mode, and then in art mode, and I would sort of defend what I was looking at and then try to find the problem. And I realized I was just completely contradicting myself and changing how I saw things. So this book was really, really helpful for me to get clear about what I really believe in. And I definitely feel that now I am much closer to a place where I feel that the spirituality side of myself and the scientific side of myself are in harmony. And I think that this theory does provide the possibility of having those things in harmony, so that we shouldn't be so afraid of analyzing these different states of mind scientifically, because we can understand more about it. I think the problem is that people get so caught up in specific scientific studies instead of looking at all of them together and realizing that science has to be cumulative. It's not just about one thing. And when you look at your own mind, it gets very, very complicated and very, very murky. So I think that it is helpful for scientists and researchers to understand their own mind, to understand these different states of mind, and to understand that dreams can be a place where they can actually give you solutions to the problems that you've been looking at, because it just allows your mind to go into a different place than it is normally. And often we block ourselves from seeing the truth for various other reasons. Sometimes we don't want to see it. Sometimes we just haven't put the pieces together, but they're there. And that comes from just our narrow human focus. We all have tunnel vision sometimes. That's just how we're made. We don't get to see all the way around our heads like an eagle does. We have a very narrow focus. So what that did for me was to help me to bring that together. And what I realized too was I now feel that religion is completely unnecessary. I don't think there's any use for religion at all. In fact, I think religion is essentially anti-cultural, and it's part of the colonial mindset where they try to force everyone to believe the same thing and to focus on their belief rather than proof, so that they focus on faith, because faith is the thing that will shut them down to the truth. Because when you look at science, what you need is doubt. So if you take all of the culture, all of the art out of religion, all of the singing, all of the dancing, all of the costumes, all of that, all of the architecture, you have nothing left but invisible spirits. So why not just go to that directly? And I think that with science, in connection with indigenous culture, which never segregated themselves into a religion, they simply have spiritual traditions, but they don't have religion in the way that other groups do, because religion has always been used as a tool of patriarchal colonial expansion by making people brainwashed to believe the same things. And I think when you do that, then you actually bring down the intelligence of everyone. And that's why so many religious people hate science and they hate intelligence. And we see that happening a lot now, that the enemy of the powerful, violent men is the intelligence of women and the reproductive knowledge. And that's what they attack. And that's been going on for thousands of years, unfortunately. But with more advanced understanding, I think that we can come to a place where we can accept our spirituality as part of who we are. It's just part of our inner vision. We all have that ability to see things in our head. And the more that we understand that, and the more that we understand our connectivity, that leads us right back into these mystical spiritual traditions that can be positive, I think, because they do make people feel better. But when you release the baggage of this other nonsense that's often very negative and harmful and violent, then you realize that stuff isn't necessary, then that can bring us to a more positive place. Because there's nothing in science that says that we should be violent or mean or heartless or cause pain to others. I think those things are we really need to discourage. The other thing that I've come to realize, and I talk a bit about creative visualization and why I think that that's such an important part of psychological therapies, and why I think it's actually a lot better than talk therapy. And that's because this theory also adds another layer to understanding why that is, which is that, just like I said, like when you get these messages through your subconscious, when you're doing creative visualization, you're awake and you're controlling what's going on in your mind. And so you're kind of doing this feedback loop in the opposite direction, where you're feeding the information back to your DNA of the solutions to your problems and healing messages. And the way to do that, I believe, is to bring light into your your subconsciousness. And you just do that by imagining light. So the way of these sort of healing mechanisms, I think, is to go within. You allow certain messages to come up spontaneously. You go towards the thing that's bothering you. You try to figure that out, and often that can be in a very dark place. But then you bring light to it, and you go through this process. So at the end, you're bringing light into the darkness of whatever it is that is bothering you, that you haven't fully understood. But the light part is very important, because I think people do visualizations and meditations without bringing the light in. And I think that just takes you to a dark place and leaves you there. And that's what a lot of talk therapy does too, unfortunately. It's like, we're going to find the problem, but then they don't give you the solution. And they think that the solution is just more talking. But actually, that can just reinforce these negative feelings and negative behaviors. So that's a really interesting thing that I think is very important. And there's a lot of people that do different kinds of creative meditations and visualizations. So that's a very interesting topic that I think needs a lot more research. And also imagine, because atheists, I would say that I'm agnostic and spiritual, but I think I also am kind of atheist, but I would say it's more of a small a atheist, because when you talk about God, it's like everything depends on what your definition of God is in order to believe in it first. You have to define what it is you're talking about, and a lot of people have very different notions of what that is. And I think a lot of atheists shut down when they see anything mystical or spiritual. They automatically think it's not scientific. And what I want to show is that that is completely ridiculous, that actually these spiritual experiences are part of who we are. And there are plenty of scientific explanations and understanding that does not dismiss it, that does understand it, because dismissing it is not scientific. You're just dismissing evidence, and you're dismissing data, and you're dismissing research, and that's a bad direction to go. And then that's when atheists becomes a lot more like religions than they are like an enlightened being, which I think most of us at some level want to be, or at least to be happy. So the other part, let's see, indigenous cultures have knowledge that has been scientifically tested a lot. And I think that's why anthropologists, ethnobotanists keep going to indigenous people. They don't go to religious people, because they know that they have the most important knowledge, and that a lot of it is either hidden or unaware of. And those things are really important. Now, of course, there are other kinds of traditional knowledge. The line between indigenous, traditional is a blurry one, because so many places have been, colonized by other people. But I do think that putting indigenous culture first, especially in a place like Canada, where they still exist and a lot of them are still able to practice their own indigenous culture. And I think now we're reaching that point where now indigenous people themselves can start testing their own customs and practices. There's no reason why indigenous people can't themselves become anthropologists. I just want to also give a little bit of thanks to a lot of the authors that I quote in it, because there's so many good authors. A lot of them have been ignored by a lot of mainstream people because they shake up the worldview that we've come to sort of accept and simplify. Jay Joseph, that I mentioned, that did a lot of research into twin studies. Jeremy Narby, of course, who wrote The Cosmic Serpent. The McKenna brothers, Dennis and Terrence, who go a lot into consciousness and how consciousness works, and they did a lot of experimenting on psychedelics. That's really, really interesting. Catherine McCune, who wrote a really good book about alchemy that influenced this book a lot. Oliver Sacks, who has passed away, but he wrote a lot about hallucinations. And Jeffrey Moussaieff Masson, who wrote about Freud, and he had special access to Anna Freud and Sigmund Freud's documents that have been hidden from the public. And he got shut down too, unfortunately, and has so much interesting and important information that I think needs to be known. And a lot more people, I think, might pull away from talk therapy if they realize just how contentious the origin and a lot of the evidence is against relying on that as a method of therapy. I also hope any politicians out there might take a look at this, especially at part 3, because that's where I deal with a lot of sort of bigger issues. I think that we really need to take a step back on pushing artificial reproduction and understanding that if a child is harmed in the way that they are conceived, then they should never be conceived in that way. I think the ethics is really, really simple and straightforward, and the evidence is robust to show that IVF and surrogacy cause a lot of physical damage and genetic damage that could be passed on for generations. There could be generations into the future that have terrible diseases. And in the same way, I believe that my disease is caused by bad reproductive practices in the past, and I believe it is caused by patriarchal religion. That's what my subconscious keeps bringing me back to, and that's why I'm pushing away from patriarchal religion and looking for a kind of spirituality that is open. There's a lot of systems that are open. Almost all of the indigenous and folk religions are open, which means you don't have to only practice them. They're not exclusive. You don't have to belong to that group even. The other is Buddhism. Buddhism is also fairly open. I think that when you take out the monastic side of things, that can be, I think, quite an unnatural lifestyle. The basic principles and philosophy of Buddhism, I think, is really, really important to understand. And that goes beyond religion. You don't have to be a Buddhist to understand or learn anything about that. And the other is unaffiliated, which is just all those people that don't want to be religious. They don't affiliate themselves with any religion. And they can believe whatever you want. Unaffiliated is the way to go, because guess what? The beliefs are whatever you want. So that is truly what the internal state is for all of us. And that's why I now believe in spiritual freedom and not in religious tolerance, because religions are oppressive, especially to children, which is why they're so obsessed with children, because they can control them. And I think that children need to be free from all of that religious indoctrination. So that's where I'm at now. Also, GMOs. I think GMOs are very harmful. Genetically modifying an organism at that gene level, what they have to do is they basically have to attack the gene. They have to attack the genome, and in order to edit it, and so that causes harm. And what we've seen now with epigenetics is that both senescence, which is aging, and cancer are related to chaos in the epigenetic processes. So they start to become more and more disordered, so that they're not doing the same things that we would expect to do to stay healthy. And I think if you attack that genome, what you're doing is you're leading that genome to become weaker. And same with artificial reproduction. The more that we interfere in those processes, especially at the moments of conception, I think that really, really causes harm. So I'm totally against GMOs as well, and that's something I've been against forever. And I'm just really sad that this is still an issue on the table and that they're still trying to push forward on it. And it's just so unnecessary because life itself will help itself. So if you allow organisms to live as they will live, and you can still influence the reproduction of plants by putting them next to each other. If they decide to hybridize and reproduce together, then they do. But that's their own process. And I think the more that we interfere with that, the more that we are causing them problems and causing ourselves problems, especially if we're going to be consuming them. It is difficult as a human being to be environmentally friendly. We are always going to have an impact. And the more of us there are, the more impact we have. So thanks for listening, and I hope you take a look at the book. And right now it's only available on paperback, but I will be hopefully getting an ebook out now. That is part of my contract, so the ebook should be out soon. I have a price for it, but I haven't seen it available yet. So hopefully within the next little while, we're going to see the ebook, and hopefully more people all around the world will be able to order it and find it online. I'm going to keep working on that, and then at some point in the future, I'm going to be working on the audiobook as well. Dreaming Life's Language. It's Kim D. Anderson, and check out KimberlyAnderson.com, and you can find it there, or you can probably look it up on Amazon. Thank you so much for joining me.